Bishop Patrick Wooden, who is 69 years old, has kept mute during upheavals, scandals, and changes in gospel community. However, that silence was broken this week. He publicly criticized Leandria Johnson in a way that no one anticipated, using a voice full of fury and years of restraint that suddenly broke. Leaders are in disbelief, supporters are split, and the entire religious community is wondering about what he said. Why now? Because it was more than controversy that motivated him to speak. For years, it was something more profound, weightier, and concealed. You'll see why this moment is causing a stir well beyond the boundaries of the church once you hear the explanation. The conflict between contemporary gospel culture and conventional church leadership has been subtly growing for years. Known for his fearless sermons and unshakable beliefs, Bishop Patrick Wooden was frequently in the epicenter of these upheavals. Even so, he refrained from naming specific individuals, particularly those who had both exceptional gifts and complex public conflicts. Among them was Leandria Johnson, a platform that has attracted millions, a voice that is unmatched, and a tale of triumph and adversity. But beneath the cheers and the press, her path has been paved with struggles of which the public only hears tidbits. Leandria has lived in a place where skill and trouble meet, from the acclaimed highs to the unvarnished, uncensored eruptions that startled church traditionalists. However, something recently changed, something that eventually forced Bishop Wooden to speak up and address what many people had been whispering for years. Today, we will analyze the specifics of what transpired, the significance of it, and the implications for the future of gospel culture. Because this is more than just a quarrel, as you will see in a moment. Generations, beliefs, expectations, and long-simmering, suppressed disappointments collide in this situation. You'll have more questions than answers after what happens next, I promise. You could just feel the atmosphere change as soon as Bishop Patrick Wooden spoke to Leandria Johnson. This was neither a casual remark nor an opinion, nor was it something he intended to slip in between sermons. It had been planned, deliberate, and years in the making. Within the gospel circle, there had been a whisper for months that Bishop Wooden had reached his breaking point. He had seen the videos, he had listened to the interviews, he had witnessed the actions that many felt went beyond what gospel performers were supposed to do. Wooden, however, remained silent. In the hopes that Leandria would change things without the need for a leader of his caliber to check him, he opted for patience over confrontation in public. But there was a price for that silence. The anxiety in the church community increased with each new film, each moment that raised eyebrows, and each outburst of annoyance or openness from Leandria. Her honesty was defended by her supporters. Critics referred to it as insurrection. She needed grace, according to some. Some said she needs to be held accountable, and Wooden watched the storm intensify while remaining in the shadows. Then came the tipping point, a situation that Bishop Wooden felt he could no longer watch from the sidelines due to its directness and publicity. Something inside of him sprang into conviction. Whether it was a performance clip, a statement she made, or a recurring pattern he could no longer ignore, he therefore spoke with the authority of a man who has been silent long enough. His voice bore the weight of a leader, weary of what he perceived to be a decline in the gospel standard. He wasn't kind with his statements. They weren't sugar-coated. Furthermore, they weren't intended to be misinterpreted. It wasn't rage. It was a warning. A warning from a man who felt that gospel culture's soul was under danger. What specifically caused this, however, is the true question that everyone is posing. At what point did Bishop Wooden conclude that he could no longer remain silent? The plot becomes much more convoluted at that point. You must comprehend Leandria Johnson's path in order to comprehend why Bishop Wooden's remarks struck such a deep chord. Due of the complexity of her story. It's not tidy. Furthermore, it's not the well-crafted story that gospel musicians typically have. Like a natural force, Leandria showed up. Unadulterated skill, heartbreaking genuineness, and a voice that had the power to tremble a room before she ever touched a microphone. She was hailed as the resurgence of gritty, deep, spirit-filled gospel music when she won Sunday Best, the type that takes hold of your heart and refuses to let go. However, she carried off stage the same rawness that made her a formidable performer. She was a loud, loving, and hurting person. She also didn't conceal it, in contrast to most artists. She didn't present herself to the cameras in a spotless, church-approved manner. The world knew when she was upset. The world was aware of her struggles. She didn't speak in private when she criticized the church leaders' judgment and hypocrisy. She made the statement in public. Her candor was praised by some, it was denounced by several. However, everyone was observing. And the gap inside the gospel community widened with each viral video, heartfelt live stream, and instance where suffering escaped before wisdom could stop it. Fans on one side believed that because of her openness, she was genuine and relatable. She was seen by them as a symbol of the church's forgotten, those who loved God but were fed up with being flawless. Leaders on the other side thought her uncensored statements were harmful, that her remarks went beyond what gospel musicians should never do, even if they were based in reality. As a result, many secretly hoped that she would take a step back, gather herself, and start over. But it wasn't just her dissatisfaction with church culture that marked the turning point, the moment that pulled Bishop Wooden into the discussion. It was the sense that she was being drawn farther away from the spiritual responsibility that Wooden and other leaders place a high importance on. She was exhausted. People close to the incident whispered, weary of performing while carrying wounds that no one helped her heal, weary of church censure, and weary of industrial pressure. Additionally, someone who is that exhausted may act erratic, careless, or even defiant. Things become risky at that point. At that point, leaders like Bishop Wooden feel obliged to intervene, not because they wish to launch an assault, but rather because they are afraid of losing someone who possesses a gift that the world sorely needs. And Wooden's furious remarks were triggered by that anxiety, that intense fear. However, what Wooden said in public was only a small portion of what has been discussed behind closed doors. So there's something much more shocking and little known, and after you hear that, you'll see why this whole thing is much more serious than most people think. When Bishop Wooden did speak up, it wasn't in a light-hearted or conversational setting. It took place during a passionate time when every statement seemed to contain decades of frustration and leadership experience. According to some present, the tension in the room seemed to drop like a thick curtain. Leandria's name was not mentioned casually by Wooden. He has witnessed the ascent and decline of numerous gospel musicians, so he is well aware of what occurs when a prominent figure is publicly criticized by a leader. The fury, the division, the backlash, and the headlines. Still, he spoke. He discussed a perilous change in gospel culture, a change that disregarded accountability while praising talent, where the distinction between ministry and entertainment became increasingly blurred and emotional openness gave way to spiritual vulnerability. He made no accusations, insults, or jokes. He didn't take that strategy. Rather, he spoke in the voice of a man who was extremely concerned about her reputation and the course of events, rather than his own. The gravity of his remarks was what caused the audience to sit up. Wooden stated that he was worried by particular gospel personalities' actions, decisions, and events. He did not enumerate them individually. He was not required to. People were aware of the precise target of the message. People felt there was a hint of hurt in Wooden's voice, nor disgust, nor rage, simply disappointment. When a leader witnesses someone straying more and farther from a safe haven, you can hear their disappointment. And the image got more distinct the farther he dug. Wooden had no intention of undermining Leandria's reputation. He wanted to caution her. He was attempting to alert the sector. His concern extended beyond her recent remarks and emotionally charged outbursts that garnered media attention, and he was attempting to alert the church. It was about the pattern and the growing gap between a stable spiritual covering and a potent gift. That disparity is risky for Wooden. Burnout is more likely to occur when an artist is more impacted by public opinion than by sound advice. The heart is at risk when the need to be relevant takes precedence over the need to stay grounded. And Wooden recognizes the signals after decades of witnessing artists collapse under the weight of unhealed wounds, fame, and ministry. The situation becomes much more severe at this point because, according to sources, Bishop Wooden wasn't the only authority who was concerned. There were conversations going on. They were making phone calls. Leaders were quietly voicing their concerns in private rather than in public, to assist her stand, not to bring her down. Many thought that Leandria was about to enter a time when the people in her life would be more important than ever. Some believed she needed to rest. She needed mentorship, according to others. Some thought she needed to be completely removed from the spotlight. The moment that stunned the room, however, arrived next. Bishop Wooden did more than simply discuss the issue. He alluded to something more profound, something he thought was simultaneously occurring on a spiritual, emotional, and societal level. The room fell silent as soon as he finished speaking. Fans are arguing, critics are responding, and authorities are attempting to determine how this will affect gospel music going forward. You'll see why Wooden's statement shocked the entire community after hearing this following section, I promise. There came a point in Bishop Wooden's speech when his tone changed. He had been talking about the obvious problems up until that moment, such as public outbursts, the conflict between gospel tradition and contemporary authenticity, and the widening gap between artists and accountability. However, he stopped, inhaled deeply, and leaned into something more profound. This was no longer about a single incident. According to Wooden, there was a spiritual deterioration and a trend that was permeating the gospel community and subtly influencing leaders, musicians, and even their followers. He believed that the sector was undergoing subtle but perilous changes. He discussed an emerging culture of unrestrained expression that occasionally eclipsed humility, a society in which openness was valued above change. There was a period when people mistakenly associated ministry with emotional instability and suffering. Leandria wasn't the only one involved. She was just the spark that lighted the fuse, the example that brought the problem to light. People sat motionless, nearly gasping for air, after hearing Wooden's words. He claimed that although the world celebrated the sensitivity of certain musicians, they were getting spiritually depleted. That when the lights went out, they had nothing left over after giving their everything on stage, and, behind closed doors, their souls were silently disintegrating as audiences applauded their candor. It was not rebellion that frightened him. Exhaustion was the source of his worry, since it may cause even the strongest voices to falter. Transparency can become self-destructive due to exhaustion. A talented artist may speak from wounds rather than wisdom due to exhaustion. And Wooden thought he saw those indicators in real time. It was like witnessing a candle burn from both ends, he said. Gorgeous, brilliant, strong, yet doomed to go out if no one intervenes to keep the flame alive. He was concerned that Leandria was becoming into a symbol of a larger dilemma because of her talent, suffering, honesty, and exposure. The dilemma of talented individuals bearing burdens they were never intended to bear alone. The issue of public pressure being misinterpreted as a goal. The predicament of a generation that feels misunderstood by its leaders and ignored by the church. This explains why his tone was weighty rather than just harsh. Leandria's voice was not being disparaged by Wooden. He was lamenting what he thought that voice could lose. People are still talking about what he said after that. He cautioned the audience that more musicians would hit their breaking points if the gospel industry didn't get back to a position of accountability, grounding, and spiritual covering. There would be more public outbursts. Emotionally, more would collapse. More would smile in public but spiral in private. It wasn't a doomsday prophecy. It was an appeal for conservation, an appeal for solidarity, an appeal for the preservation of gifts that were. Want to bear the burden of the entire world by yourself? Then the moment arrived that rocked social media, because Wooden was more than just a leader. He spoke as someone who has spent decades bearing his own difficulties in quiet, someone who knew what it was like to be strong while breaking on the inside, to talk while battling, and to lead while hurting. When people understood he wasn't simply talking about her, the room fell silent. He was discussing the church, the industry, and a culture that rarely promotes healing, but instead glorifies brokenness. Nevertheless, the story isn't over despite everything, because what transpired following Wooden's remarks may be even more unexpected and indicative of the direction this whole matter is taking. You'll see why this event has become one of the most talked about turning points in recent gospel history when you hear the response that ensued, both inside and outside the church. Bishop Wooden's message wasn't received well by the general populace. It didn't glide across social media feeds or stroll courteously through church halls. Like a spark tossed into dried leaves, it exploded over gospel circles, church platforms, reaction videos, live streams, and comment sections. People took sides in a matter of hours. Wooden was warranted, according to some. He went too far, according to others. He didn't go far enough, according to many. Those who felt stuck in the midst were another group. Those who appreciate Leandria's talent and emotion while also acknowledging the gravity of Wooden's worries. Suddenly, a discussion that had been discreetly taking on behind closed doors for years became a national one. But it wasn't just Wooden's words that caused such a strong reaction. That was what his remarks stood for. This has nothing to do with gossip. This had to do with a collision between generations. Elderly leaders were relieved that someone had finally voiced what they had been muttering to themselves for far too long. Younger Christians felt insulted, as if the church was once again enforcing authenticity regulations rather than providing empathy. Leandria's supporters became defensive, claiming that she was being singled out for voicing the kind of candor that the religion forbids. Her recent acts, according to critics, verified Wooden's thesis, and they felt justified. Everyone had an opinion, but it wasn't the most influential aspect of the response. The reason for the emotion was that this was more than just a dispute between a bishop and a gospel performer. The identity of contemporary gospel culture, the future of spiritual leadership, the conflict between tradition and openness, and the conflict between grace and responsibility were all topics of discussion. Pastors started answering as well. Wooden's warning was endorsed by some, who said he spoke with the love of a leader after witnessing a generation fall into spiritual isolation and emotional independence. Some defended Leandria's candor, arguing that the church should learn to listen rather than respond and develop stronger skin and thinner barriers. Executives in the music industry also had a voice. Some acknowledged in private that they had been worried for a while, not only for Leandria, but for a number of musicians juggling their personal struggles with stardom. They claimed that the line between authenticity and burnout was getting narrower. The industry was becoming more demanding, and the pressure was increasing. However, the most unexpected responses came from regular folks, believers who admitted they were conflicted because many identified with Leandria's struggle. Imperfect, emotional, raw, attempting to serve God while battling internal issues. Many admired Wooden's position as a leader who refused to remain mute in the face of talented individuals straying into perilous areas. The story was larger than any of them because of this collision of experiences. It reached a deeper level, a universal battle that the church seldom discusses. When someone is in pain, how do you lead them? How may a gifted person be corrected? How can you help someone who is vulnerable but honest? And above all, how do you protect someone who is bleeding in public? There was more than simply noise in response. It served as a mirror reflecting the silent annoyances and anxieties of the whole gospel community. However, something else was going on behind the scenes while everyone else was disputing, something that no one anticipated. A sequence of low-key discussions, messages, and leaders reaching out to one another in order to resolve a single issue rather than to quarrel or attack. What comes next? Because what happened next would determine whether this moment served as a catalyst for healing or as fuel for a larger fire after Wooden's message rocked the audience.